Welcome to Real Crusades History. My name is J. Stephen Roberts, and I'm going to be your host today for the podcast. Today our topic is going to be the Third Crusade, and carrying on with our chronology from last time, we covered the conquest of Cyprus in 1191. We are moving on to the Siege of Acre. We are going to take a little bit of a step back in the chronology and cover the full siege from 1189 to 1191. So I am joined by my co-host Scott Amos.
Hello. Good morning, Stephen. Morning, Dr. Donnachie and Dr. Schrader.
Yeah, and as Scott has done for me there, our two guests are Dr. Helena Schrader, who is a regular here with us. Dr. Schrader, welcome back. Thanks for being here again.
It's always a pleasure to be here, Jay.
Great. And and just so everybody knows, since we have two Stevens here, I'm going to be Jay for this podcast. Jay Steven. So I'll be Jay, and then Dr. Donnachie will be Steve/Steven. So and as I was saying there, we have Dr. Stephen Donnachie with us from Swansea. Dr. Donnachie, how are you?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me back.
Thanks so much for being here. This is going to be great. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the Siege of Acre. Again, as I said, we're going to go back to the beginning of the siege because the Siege of Acre gets going well before either Philip of France or Richard the Lionheart arrive in Outremer. It begins in 1189. Initiated by Guy of Lusignan and his allies. So let's kind of start there. The interesting thing about this period is this Crusader party under Guy of Lusignan is able to establish itself outside of Acre, and at first they're not able to fully blockade the city, but over time, all sorts of different groups from all over Europe. I mean, really, when you read about all these different contingents that showed up, it seemed like, at some point there was a contingent from pretty much every corner of Europe showing up. They were eventually able to fully blockade the city, but nevertheless, for these first couple years before the arrival of the major kings of Europe, there really was almost kind of this stalemate. So I'm going to let Dr. Schrader open us up here. Dr. Schrader, do you want to talk a little bit about this early period of the Siege of Acre?
Well, I didn't want to get into too much depth because it's actually quite a gruesome story, as you say, of stalemate, where you have the Crusaders occasionally assaulting the city, and then they'll get attacked from Saladin's army, which is surrounding the Crusader camp, so that they have to turn and fight off the attack at the rear. Sometimes they tried to attack Saladin's camp, and then the people would sally, the Saracens would sally out of Acre and attack them in the rear if they went the other direction. There are a number of quite dismal days when there are severe casualties, and when they weren't actually fighting and losing casualties that way, the siege camp was frequently subject to various diseases. Of course, many people who came from the west were not used to the climate or the food. I'm sure the conditions at this camp were not the most sanitary, and so that you have actual continuous attrition based on, as I say, illness, as well as these skirmishes and the occasional larger conflict. But it really drags on for 2 years of really quite unpleasant stalemate.
Dr. Donnachie, did you have any comments about this early period of the siege?
I mean, we tend to see it as the early period, in really this period up until when Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France arrive is really the majority of the siege.
Right.
Philip turns up in April of 1191, and Richard turns up after conquering Cyprus in June, and the city's fallen by the middle of July of that year. But it had already been ongoing since August of 1189, and it had dragged down to a stalemate. But the efforts of the native Franks and the arriving Crusaders to maintain the blockade of that city for almost over a year and almost 2 years had done an awful lot of work to put it into a position so that when Richard and Philip finally arrived, they had it tipped everything in their favour. If not for this work by the Franks and by the arriving Crusaders before the kings of France and England, the city would not have been in such a perilous state as it had been.
Wouldn't have been ripe for conquer.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to see like sort of Richard and Philip as sort of turning up, and that's where the action starts. But really, it's one of the great set piece sieges of the 12th century, with everything you could possibly sort of want in it, and as far as a story of a siege goes, with artillery, mass assaults, blockade by sea, the creation of siege towers, and one of the densest concentrations of siege towers in the 12th century of medieval warfare.
So really, yeah, we should not underestimate this long effort that went on before the big personalities of the Third Crusade arrive. Just kind of reading through some of my sources on this siege, there was one particular battle on October 4th of 1189 that sort of seems to kind of be a good example of what was going on, the type of conflict that would occur. It was really just this brutal struggle between Saladin's forces and the Christian army. And it seemed to go both ways at different times. At one point, the Christians seemed to be overcoming Saladin, but then he swept back in and inflicted a lot of damage, and there's a huge amount of deaths on both sides. But ultimately, the result was kind of that not much really changed. I mean, the Christian army was able to maintain their position, and Saladin wasn't able to dislodge them. And Saladin's army still sort of remained in its position. And I guess this was also the incident where Gerard of Ridderford died. So I thought perhaps, Dr. Schrader, you might have some comments on that, since I know that you know quite a bit about Gerard.
Of course, it's very hard at this stage to really know what happened, but it would appear that Ridderford repeated his normal standard practice of charging ahead and not ensuring that he was supported. And as a result, the Templars get cut off, and it's because they get cut off, of course, that they get slaughtered. Ridderford gets killed. So it was essentially, I'm not going to say it was exactly like the Springs of Cresson, because that was even worse in some ways, but it was another incident where basically there was poor leadership on the part of the Templars, and the same thing was poor leadership on the part of the Crusaders, because Guy de Lusignan doesn't really support them correctly. The army disintegrates into plundering, partly because they were half-starved by this point. I think this was largely a battle that was lost by fragmented and poor leadership.
So, Dr. Donnachie, what do you think about the Templars' conduct during this early phase of the siege?
Not as well as they could have done. We have a sort of professionalized image of the Templars, and certainly given the nature of their order, they're one of the most experienced and most ordered of fighting forces in the Latin East. But of course, in the fog of war, battle is awfully hard to control, and once opportunities for looting have present themselves, soldiers often want to do that. It's a perennial problem, sort of medieval warfare, maintaining order and control. It did not go well, but it was an important battle that they were fighting, and this is the point in time when while the siege has been started since August, it's yet for the Franks to establish full control over the north side of Acre and fully invest the city. Given the importance of their task, you would have thought they might have had a bit more focus, but evidently not.
After Guy de Lusignan had established a base, other parties began to show up. Pisans, Frisians, Danes. I mean, they all seemed to establish their own independent parties. How were they independent? What were the types of conflicts they had with Guy's original group, rivalries that developed? Dr. Donnachie?
Sort of perennial problem of the Crusades is the nature of command structure and leadership of crusading armies. And this goes all the way up from the various conflicts between the leaders of the First Crusade all the way through. As crusading becomes more sort of militarized and organized in the later 12th and into the 13th centuries, issues over command are less of a problem, but they do still crop up. In the First Crusade, you have rivals between Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond, etc. In the Second Crusade, you have between Louis VII and the German Emperor Conrad. Even on the Third Crusade, you have Richard and Philip, of course, Guy and Conrad. And later on, the same is true in things like the Fifth Crusade, where everyone's waiting for the German Emperor to turn up to take command. Because crusading is sort of organized on a more regional and national level, you have national groups and regional groups under their own leaders, accepting their own leaders' leadership, effectively sort of an international campaign. Who's in charge? Now, if you have someone of sufficient, prestige and magnitude, like the German Emperor, turn up, everyone can agree, maybe a bit reluctantly, they can agree that the Emperor has the authority to conduct, be in charge. But when you don't have someone of sufficient magnitude like that, then they can't agree as to what is to be done. So you have Guy as the local king. Okay, yes, he would probably be a choice, since it is his kingdom that has been destroyed, and that the siege has attempted to capture one of its principal cities and to restore his kingdom to its boundaries. But he'd proven himself incapable. He'd lost the True Cross. He'd lost Hattin. He was not a popular commander. He didn't have necessarily the force of personality to compare to some of the others who had arrived, people like Henry of Champagne or James d'Avenay, for example, who would be much more used to fighting alongside and with their own comrades and kinfolk and brethren from their own lands than having to submit to Guy or another foreign lord. So you have this sort of clash of personalities.
And I think it's one of the fascinating things that you read about that whole entire period before. You almost never hear of Guy. I mean, there's occasional references to him, but there's actually almost more references to his brother, Geoffrey,
Yes.
as at one point doing a great heroic defense of the camp, etc. So it really underlines the effect to which he was discredited and not a very effective leader. And another thing I would raise, and it's something that has not been raised in the Chronicles, but somebody who spent so much of their lives living abroad, you have, as you say, people from Friesland and from Denmark arriving without any real very strong leadership there. And I ask myself, to what language they communicate? Because if you have French, basically Frankish lords, obviously Richard speaks French, the aristocracy speaks Latin, or some of the better educated speak Latin and can use Latin to communicate as a lingua franca. But you wonder about these groups of crusaders coming at that lower level, the Pisans, as I say, and the Friesans and the Danes, and you think, well, could they even communicate with their fellow crusaders?
Eventually, Conrad of Montferrat left Tyre and joined. Did he ever actually submit Guy as king?
No. Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but I understood that he came down. He had the support of Philip II, who acknowledges him as king. Richard comes in and is acknowledging Guy, and it's during the siege of Tyre, actually, or shortly after the surrender of Tyre, that there's a big council with the leaders of the crusade there and most of the barons of Jerusalem, and they come up with this deal that Guy will remain king in his lifetime, but that Conrad will be his heir. That doesn't last very long, but that's the agreement that's made at that time, and Conrad never acknowledges Guy. I don't think he ever does homage to Guy, but because he leaves the siege camp almost immediately after that deal. He goes with Philip II and the prisoners that Philip's taken.
Okay.
And as far as he's never seen again in Guy at the same place as Guy. He starts to have his own separate negotiations with Saladin, etc. Well, Richard's also negotiating, something we can talk about in a later.
I just had one source that said Conrad actually did acknowledge Guy as king and accept his leadership, but I guess it was wrong.
Conrad appears in one of Guy's charters in 1190, where he's acknowledged as being the Lord of Tyr, Dominus Tyri, which is obviously just acknowledging his de facto stance that he's in control of Tyre. He appears in his charter and he signs the charter confirming its contents and everything. This isn't necessarily an act of homage or anything. There's nothing to suggest that in itself is an act of homage rather than as a legal act of, acknowledging that this is a legal matter that has occurred. Whether or not one could argue that might be a form of not homage, but acknowledging sort of Guy's superior status, but it doesn't really work because people like Richard I and Philip II also appear signing charters for Conrad and Guy as well, and that's not them acknowledging Conrad or Guy as being superior than the King of England or the King of France. He does turn up. He's at Acre. He obviously has his own interest to oversee while he's there, because if he's going to put forward his candidature for the crown and his candidature for the leadership of the barons, he's got to be where the action is, and for a lot of the time that's at Acre. So he is constantly backwards and forwards between Tyre, but I don't think he ever really submits in that same way. Maybe, he's dealing with Guy, with Guy, but not actually submitting. There's no kind of concept of being a vassal to him. And you do get this meeting where Richard and Philip, after Acre's fallen, in agreement with the barons, determine that Guy will remain as king for the rest of his life, and then Conrad will be his heir.
And as I say, but they overlap in Acre a very short time, actually, because it basically only the time that they're fighting, because as soon as the city surrenders, Conrad retreats to Tyre with Philip II, and Philip leaves from there for France, and Guy remains down with Richard and for the rest of the campaign. And this agreement which they make, which is in, as you say, in August of 1191, is already overturned, in March of 1192, when Richard's forced to acknowledge that Guy's never going to be accepted by the barons of Jerusalem.
Real quick, let's talk just a little bit about, I know this isn't on the notes, and I'm kind of surprised I forgot to put this in there, actually. The death of Sibylla. I guess I'm going to start with you on this, Dr. Schrader. So Sibylla dies, I guess it's towards the end of 1190, maybe?
November, I believe.
Yeah.
Was it November, October or November, I'm sorry. Could have been October.
Yeah, it was around then. But so she dies. Let's talk a little bit about how that changed the political situation.
Well, that's critical. Thank you for asking that question, because when Sibylla, the Guy de Lusignan's claim to the throne of Jerusalem was through his wife. He was king as consort of Sibylla. And when Sibylla dies, there's a legal case for saying that his claim to the throne died with her. The alternative argument is he was an anointed king, and once he's anointed, he's king for life. That was why we came to this other agreement we just talked about. But for many of the barons of Jerusalem, including significantly Bailey and Evelyn, took the legal position that no, Guy's claim to the throne was extinguished with the death of Sibylla, and notably her two daughters by him. So there's no heirs of Sibylla's body left. She has no heirs when she dies. And he argues that therefore her half-sister, the surviving daughter of Amory, or Almaric the First of Jerusalem, is now the legal queen of Jerusalem.
Right. Dr. Donnachie, did you want to add to that?
No, I mean, once Sibylla's dead, the heir is gone. Guy has no legal standing, especially as the daughters are gone as well. If the daughters had lived, Guy could have remained to act as regent, as their father and their nearest male relative, which would have been at least until they'd come of age. But with them all dead, there's nothing to remain. He's only because he's been anointed and crowned as king and he's there on the ground at the time. And Isabella remains. Isabella is the next heir. So her next male kin is, well, technically at that immediate point in time, Humphrey IV of Tauron, though not for much longer, and her stepfather, Balian of Ebelin. So, as you know, the Ebelins are the ones who would like to be rid of Guy now that they're finally legally able to do so. The opportunity has presented itself, and out he goes.
And it's kind of a testament to the extremely difficult conditions that must have been present in terms of daily life in the camp. That Guy's entire family is wiped out. I mean, his wife and his two daughters. Illness was obviously commonplace. Let's talk a little bit about now. Let's get into 1191. Philip II of France arrives first with his contingent. And he's going to show, I believe it's April 20th he shows up, or sometime in April.
Yes.
Let's start with Dr. Donnachie on this one. Do you want to kind of discuss how his arrival impacted the siege, and maybe also get into a little bit about how his forces would compare with Richard's?
When Philip arrives, I mean, he obviously arrives ahead of Richard, who's busy off conquering Cyprus. And no doubt this would have been a massive sort of morale boost to the beleaguered besiegers of Acre, seeing the King of France arrive with all of his troops, with all of his ships, all of his supplies, once again significantly pushing the military the balance of military affairs in their favour. And he turns up, he sets up, and he doesn't get up to a lot initially. He's waiting for Richard. He begins preparing the ground. He begins setting up his siege machinery, his artillery, setting up camp, and levelling the ground in front of him, but doesn't engage in any serious or major assaults on the city at this point in time. Partly because with all of the issues he'd had with Richard and Messina, and then obviously later Cyprus, when Cyprus would come up, when he'd find out that he'd conquered it, they'd made an agreement with Richard that they would share any of the conquests, any of the spoils between them. And obviously he doesn't necessarily want to get ahead of himself or, and have any arguments left with when Richard turns up and finds out maybe he's accidentally conquered the city before Richard had arrived. So he sits and waits. How many men does he have? Well, his forces and Richard's forces are probably roughly comparable. The sources often speak of 100,000 men and things like that, which is obviously just trying to convey a measure of magnitude, that there are lots of them rather than an accurate number of troops. Probably something in the order of about 10,000 each would seem roughly, maybe a bit more. And we know that the Duke of Burgundy, on Philip's behalf, had contracted ships for the Genoese for 650 knights. And normally you tend to get a ratio of somewhere between 5-1 or 8-1 infantry per knights. And there would also have been, auxiliary cavalry and things like that. So somewhere in the order of 10,000 seems about reasonable. And they're prepared and they're ready, and they get ready to setting the scene, waiting for Richard to arrive. And when Richard arrives, he obviously turns up and he has quite a grandstand moment.
Dr. Schrader, did you want to add to that?
No, I think that covers it. I was glad to hear Steve Donnachie address the numbers, because, in fact, Richard had much larger territories. So my instinct was to say he probably would have been able to call on more men. But, of course, France was still a very rich country and, of course, had probably more nobles than Richard had.
Right, and that seems to be the impression we get, too, from the Muslim sources. The Muslim authors appear to view Richard's arrival as more important, more of an event than Philip's arrival. I think it's Baha ad-Din who says that Philip II is higher in rank than Richard, but that Richard obviously was wealthier and had more men, that sort of thing. And then Ibn al-Athir calls his comments about Richard are really interesting. He calls him the remarkable man of his time, and says that Islam was never afflicted with a greater disaster than his arrival. So, yeah, let's kind of talk a little bit now about Richard's arrival. He arrives, obviously, several months later. Dr. Schrader, would you like to take that up first?
Richard knew how to put on a good show, and he comes in, sort of with the full fleet behind him, with, of course, the victory over Cyprus behind him, which has added both to his prestige and his fortune. And he's also just attacked a ship, apparently, offshore, and managed to sink that as well. So, of course, he has the benefit of having some very dramatic victories that were important for the siege that was about to take place.
Dr. Donnachie?
He has this sort of great grandstand moment where he turns up and he arrives, and it's all very much sort of pomp and ceremony to display sort of his magnificence and all that sort of thing. After all, he's just conquered Cyprus as well, so no doubt he has all the sort of resources of a freshly conquered island in tow with him. And certainly this impresses a lot of the of the Muslim chroniclers, and in part I think their respect and prestige for Richard that they give him is because ultimately he's the one who stays on in the Holy Land and continues the crusade with his great rivalry and his conflict with Saladin, whereas Philip gets up and leaves relatively quickly after the Siege of Acre, so therefore doesn't make as much of an impact on the mind of the Muslim chroniclers and observers at that time.
I would agree that some of their praise is sort of retrospective. It's after they know how well Richard has fought Saladin that they sort of retrospectively put it on to the arrival.
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting, too, you mentioned, Dr. Donnachie, sort of the spectacle that Richard kind of presents. I know that the Gesta Regis Ricardi, the physical description we get of Richard there is really vivid, and so you really get this sense that this was this kind of big event. So we were also going to maybe try to touch a little bit on the use of siege machinery. I love the names we get for the siege engines, like Bad Neighbor, God's Own, Catapult. These are interesting ways that they're referred to. Let's start with you, Dr. Donnachie. How would siege engines have been deployed in a situation like this?
The purpose of siege engines in things like things like trebuchets and things that are going to fire missiles of some form are. We have this popular image that they're there to sort of like smash down the walls and create big holes and breaches to people to storm through. But for the most part, until counterweight trebuchets become more prevalent, and this is the time when they're starting to become prevalent, the idea of is to not create a great big hole in the wall, which you can then storm through, but to destroy the various fortifications atop walls, the towers, the crenellations, the walkways, the hoardings that the defenders of the garrison use to be able to protect themselves and hold off anyone who's attempting to attack the wall. And so by clearing sections of the wall, by damaging them repeatedly, you can approach the wall a lot easier and get your men over it or through it or get up to it to do further damage through mining and sapping or battering rams or ladders simply to go over the top of it. So the idea is what they tend to do is that they try to concentrate these artillery pieces to focus on specific areas. And the Franks and the Crusaders had arrived before this, had been building their own and giving them all these names, and had steadily been wearing down sections of the wall, which then tried to assault and had mixed successes, getting to the wall, damaging the wall, being forced back by sallies by the defenders. And then when Richard turns up, he and Philip concentrate their efforts on one specific section of the wall, a place called the Cursed Tower, which is in the corner, the sort of northeastern corner of the city, and focus fire on that area to try and bring it down. And because they do it so frequently and so consistently with so many, it actually does start to bring down the wall itself rather than just damaging the surrounding defensive areas.
Dr. Schrader, did you want to say anything about siege equipment?
No, I'm going to defer. I'm going to defer to Dr. Donnachie on that. I'd only like to raise a question of how important were the fleets, because one of the chronicles I read. Now, you seem to be better at this than I am, Jay. Exactly which one of the Muslim chroniclers emphasized that after the fleet of Richard arrived, they could no longer get any ships in. And although there had been a blockade of Acre throughout the siege, there had been a number of instances where Saladin had been able to get ships through to relieve the garrison or even to replace the garrison at one point. And one of the chronicles stresses that after Richard's fleet was blockading Acre, it was hopeless to get any more supplies in. So that while you have the battering going on from the siege engines on the walls, I also think the garrison realized that there was absolutely no hope of relief anymore, and therefore the siege aspect, the starvation aspect, was also critical to their ultimate decision to surrender.
To add to that, one thing we kind of often forget is that keeping ships out at sea, especially in the Middle Ages, to blockade a port for the Siege of Acre is almost 2 years long, is really, really hard because of the wear and tear and damage simply done to the ships at that time. And obviously all the ships that are in the harbour itself of Acre under Muslim control are relatively safe from all the weather and the storms in the harbour, whereas the Crusader ships and the Frankish ships that they've got around have to go out and stay out for days at a time, which obviously brings, damages them. And then they have to be brought back and beached, or they head up to Tyre. So they're not able, while they have a better control of the sea, they're not always able to maintain a consistent blockade. Yeah. And then when Richard and Philip come and they've got their fleets, which are fresh, and they've just come from Cyprus, they've got so many ships that are so fresh that they simply cannot, they can finally fully and completely blockade the entirety of the port, and stopping these various blockade runners of Muslim ships that would occasionally get through armed with men and supplies to keep the siege going a bit longer for the garrison.
What was the ultimate cause of the fall of the city?
That's really a good question, Scott, because as I say, when I read the Chronicles, I'm not sure whether it was lack of supplies or that sense of hopelessness that now they can't get supplied, or if it was, as I say, the gradual crumbling of the walls, or that there's not a dramatic breach here as there was at the Siege of Jerusalem. Maybe Dr. Donnachie has a better idea.
To put it simply, all of the above. The siege has gone on for almost 2 years, and while it was only in the last few months that the blockade had been completely effective in surrounding the city from the sea, 2 years of consistent warfare of siege had taken its toll on the garrison. They simply didn't have the men or the money or the food to hold out. They've been suffering from famine and inflated prices from a lack of food, just as the Crusaders outside besieging the city had. And this had taken its toll on the will of the garrison to resist. In addition, they'd been under consistent assault, massed assaults, and the use of artillery and siege towers, including a siege tower from the sea, where the Pisans had strapped two ships together to build a siege tower to attack the defences of the harbour. And this had gone on and on and on and worn them down, and their defences were crumbling. The cursed tower had started to fall, sections of the wall around it had started to fall down. The Franks and the Crusaders were able to get up to the walls to consistently assault them. They know that they can't hold on forever, that time is now very much running out. Before they could hold on, there was the idea that ships would come in, they didn't have complete control of the sea, the blockade runners would get to them, but now they can't. And what's more is they know Saladin's out there. They can see his army up on the hills above Acre behind the Crusader encampment. And Saladin, either because he can't or because he won't, is unable to bring all of his forces to bear on the Crusaders, onto this Crusader camp, and defeat the besieging army and drive them away so that the city can be relieved. They're running out of food, they're running out of supplies, their defences are falling. They've got no choice but to basically capitulate and get terms rather than face a successful storming of the city and the possibility of sack and destruction that would come from a successful army breaking into a city.
This had also a large effect on Saladin himself. Did this affect his leadership, his ability to lead this long and protracted siege? Where was he, say, psychologically at this point?
I think one imagines it must have affected knocked his confidence in his ability to command. It must have knocked the confidence of his emirs and his supporters, because Saladin is leading a confederated force in his. They must have, seen that maybe challenged his dominance over these emirs, and maybe they started to second guess him and question him. But ultimately, it's a stalemate. I mean, Saladin's army, despite their constant fighting with the Crusader encampment, isn't defeated properly and significantly in battle, and likewise he isn't able to do the same to them. The loss of the city over which so much fighting has occurred as undoubtedly a blow to his command and people's confidence in him, and is going to take a hit to their morale. But he still holds his army together, and it's still there, and continues to hold it together for the rest of the crusade.
See, we don't have any evidence that there was severe disaffection among his army at this time, which is quite curious, because you would have thought we would have had some echoes of that. But I haven't seen anything that suggests that he was having severe problems at this time.
Talking about the garrison and the desperation of their situation, previously they had been attempting to offer terms to Richard and Philip in which they would get their lives, or they would get to depart the city. But
they initially wanted to have able to take all their goods with them, and the final deal is that their lives are actually guaranteed, but they are supposed to surrender hostages for the terms, which are that Saladin is supposed to pay, basically, or you can call it a ransom for them, or pay money to the Crusaders. Very, very critical, and I think too often overlooked. And the terms of the surrender required Saladin to give roughly 2,500, some sources say equal numbers to the numbers of hostages, or whatever. But some of the captives that have been taken at Hattin, and we should really not underestimate this, I'm going to stress this, for the Franks, for the natives of Outremer, that was a very, very important part of the negotiation. It wasn't just about the true costs or money. It was about lives. It was about their wives, their children, their colleagues, their comrades that had been taken at Hattin or after Hattin. Those 15,000 women and children that had been marched into prison camps after the fall of Jerusalem, are part of that package. Not all of them, because they were 15,000, and they're only being able to negotiate for 2,500. But some of them might have been returned if this deal had gone through.
That brings us to Richard's massacre of the garrison of Acre, especially in light of what you just said, Dr. Schrader, about the large number of Christian hostages that Saladin held. When Richard finally massacred the prisoners, is this something you think Saladin would have expected him to do? Or
Scott, I honestly don't. I think that's the last thing Saladin expected, and that's part of maybe the reason Richard did it. And like to hear Dr. Donnachie's view on this. But most of the accounts stress the fact that Saladin had reneged on his promise depending on which version you read, there had been multiple dates and extensions to the deadline he'd been given to bring back the True Cross and bring the hostages. And some of them are quite dramatic about the Christians actually being told the True Cross is finally there, and them gathering and expecting it, and then it doesn't appear. And the continuation of Tyre, the Lyon continuation of Tyre, has a fairly dramatic description of the lamentations and distress in the Christian camp when they realize the captives aren't being released. That they aren't seeing any of their comrades being returned. And it specifically says that Richard responds to this. I just see if I can try to find it, by deciding he has to kill the hostages. Other people have talked about the military impossibility of guarding hostages while he continues with the crusade, or pure revenge kinds of motivations. But I don't think we should underestimate that Richard was also a king that had to respond to popular feeling. And the popular feeling in the Crusader camp was one of betrayal, when Saladin, for the 17th time, did not deliver on his promise of releasing either the True Cross or the captives.
But it would just seem like to me that Richard's execution of the hostages would just guarantee the same thing would happen on Saladin's side, that he would respond by doing the same thing.
But Richard's hostages were the garrison. Saladin's hostages were predominantly women and children who were already slaves. He didn't have to kill them. All he had to do was send them back into slavery.
I see. Okay. The prisoners that Richard executed, would they have gained martyrdom from an Islamic point of view?
Martyrdom is the term that's used in the sources, but in the Islamic sources, that these prisoners have been martyred. You could see them. They could be seen as being martyrs, as they killed in participation of the jihad that Saladin had been waging against the Crusaders.
Excuse me, I did find the passage here that it's, that Saladin had promised the kings of France and England that he would hand the Holy Cross back to the Christians and would release one Christian that he held in prison for every Saracen they had captured in the city. They agreed to this, for they were keen for the Christians to be released from Saracen captivity. And then later it says, so when King Richard saw the people weeping and lamenting because Saladin had deceived them, he had great pity and wanted to calm those who were in such great distress. He ordered the Saracens whom he had captured in his sector to be brought before him, etc. Now, we all know that these chronicles cannot be taken verbatim, but I think this does hint at a morale issue that's been too often overlooked in more recent historical descriptions of the massacre.
We often tend to think of medieval warfare in projecting many of our own notions on what constitutes being an army back onto them. But this is an age in which leadership, military leadership, kingship is very personal, based around relationship between individuals. Richard, as much as he's king and a commander of army, has to manage his nobles, and they in turn have to manage their various underlings. And when your underlings are baying for blood and you have to hold your army together, what is Richard going to really do? I mean, the traditional argument is that Richard's decision to massacre the prisoners is one based out of military pragmatism. He can't contain this many prisoners in the rear of his lines at Acre while he continues crusade, nor can he just release them back to Saladin, only to them to come and fight him again. So he makes the military pragmatic one, which is to massacre them. And this is something that occurred in warfare. It's an expected part of medieval warfare. We have our own senses of modern warfare in which we have rules and regulations and structures and order. But this isn't something that exists in the same way in the Middle Ages. This is something that is part and parcel of warfare, and more so when that warfare is tinged with the rhetoric and ideology of religious warfare between crusade and jihad. And Richard knows that if the True Cross doesn't come back, and if Saladin doesn't keep his promises or continues to play for time, and Saladin is playing for time, because the longer he can keep this going, the greater the likelihood of the Crusader army falling apart or running out of resources, and the less capable it will be, that as long as this keeps going, that the army is in danger. So Richard makes his decision. And in a very modern context, we would condemn him for such things, but this is an expected part of medieval warfare at the time. And we shouldn't underestimate the very convincing and very overpowering notion of motivation of simple revenge. Soldiers under such pressure for months on end in warfare ultimately end up breaking. And these are the things that they do. And that's very much a part of medieval warfare, as it's indeed very much part of our own warfare. And we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that this is a part of, aspect of warfare that we have left behind in the Middle Ages, because it isn't. And they massacre them. And Richard knows that that's what has to do if he is to keep his army together.
I would also point out Henry V slaughters his prisoners in the middle of Battle of Agincourt, which of course was much less of an ideological war.
Yeah, and Saladin massacred the Templars after.
Yeah,
that was
exactly.
after. Yeah.
But this brings another question. I've read varying sources that say it was all men at arms that were killed, or others say it included women and children. Some say it was done in an orderly fashion. Others say they were just rushed by a mass of men and just slaughtered indiscriminately.
I don't think there's any question that it was just the garrison. There were no women and children involved.
There were no women and children. Okay.
Interesting.
There is no evidence for sure that there were even women and children in Acre. After all, Saladin had sent an elite garrison to hold the city against the Crusaders. He'd relieved it during the siege with more men because the men were getting exhausted and wanted to go home to their wives and children. There's no evidence. I can't say there were no camp followers or whatever, but there was not a large number of women and children. Hardly, I can't imagine children there in the context. And the terms of the agreement was that Richard would hold hostages to ensure that Saladin kept his word, which he did not. But those hostages were not women and children.
They were all men at arms of the garrison.
They were all garrison.
Okay.
It is possible that we don't have a full breakdown of the demographics of the garrison of Acre. But it seems unlikely there would have been significant numbers of women and children within the garrison itself after 2 years of sieges and troops being brought into the city. Certainly the majority of the prisoners who are going to be executed will be military men of this garrison itself. There is a possibility this includes women and children, but they can't have made up enough. Even once the city had been taken after the Battle of Hattin, there may have been Muslim women and children who remained within the city, but even when this is going on, the death toll within the city from starvation, from assaults and everything else would have killed a large number of the populace at the time as well. Richard, it could have happened. It could have included men and women and children. But given that this is a garrison for a 2-year siege, it's probably not going to include very many, if there are any at all. But unfortunately, the sources aren't completely clear. They don't all agree. So all we know is that Richard massacres the garrison, whoever that was.
The Muslims did not use women as troops. There may have been camp followers. There may have been the children of prostitutes in the city left over, but they would not have been members of the garrison. You don't have women fighting in Islam, certainly not in 12th century Islam.
Not on sort of frontline duties and things like that. But when an assault is coming over the wall, one does wonder what exactly people are going to do. And people do have a vested interest in keeping themselves alive.
Yeah. No question. But I'm saying that's not part of the garrison. I'm saying you may have had women inside the city, as I say, in various functions and duties, but they wouldn't have been part of the garrison.
So are you saying, Dr. Schrader, that even if there had been women in there when the city was taken over, that more than likely they might not have even been kept with the male garrison prisoners?
Well, my understanding is not all of the garrison was even held. That Richard held 2,500 or other numbers. I mean, you see some strange numbers like 16,000, which is as absurd as the allegedly 60,000 Christian men that were defending Jerusalem after they'd lost everything at Hattin. I mean, so these numbers are not very reliable. But it was not about everybody in the city being held. Right. They let some of them go. They even described how proud they were. One of these dramatic descriptions, I think it's in the itinerarium, describes how most of the garrison marches out, and despite being defeated, they're proud and if only they hadn't been Muslim, they would have been wonderful soldiers. It isn't everybody in the city that's held, and therefore the men that are held as hostages are I still argue, definitively fighting men that were held, and the most important ones who they hoped to get the largest ransoms for and who were most valuable to them. They would not have been the riffraff. They would not have been the camp followers. They would not have been women and children.
One can imagine, too, I mean, again, this is just speculation, but women inside of the city may have been slaves themselves already, and
Correct.
so they probably would have passed on as property to the conquering Christians in some respect. I know we're kind of spending a lot of time on the Massacre of the Garrison, but it is kind of one of the set-piece events of the Third Crusade. Dr. Donnachie and Dr. Schrader, you both brought this up earlier. Again, we do get this sense from the Christian sources and even from the Muslim sources that Saladin was using this as a delaying tactic. This event is often used as a way to sort of castigate Richard and say, well, wasn't he a big jerk? He killed all these people. But we could almost say that Saladin seems to have been sort of gambling with the lives of these people. And, one would expect him to do that because he's a military leader. I mean, he's not going to be more concerned with anything than that. Let me start with you, Dr. Donnachie. Do you think that that's kind of what we could say here, that perhaps Saladin himself was responsible to some extent for these men's deaths?
Saladin's playing for time because he needs to keep the Crusaders, the Franks, at Acre as long as possible, so he can gather more troops himself. He can prepare for an attack on them. He can prepare the ground in front of them. He can make them deplete their resources. He knows that as long as he's in negotiations, he can keep things spinning out as long as he possibly can. And it would seem foolish and almost naive to think of Saladin, who is, has been a political power in the region for decades, wouldn't have possibly conceived that at some point that someone might call his bluff or something at the end and kill the prisoners or do something with the prisoners. Is Saladin responsible insofar that he is the power and authority who is negotiating with Richard and therefore has, is part of that power, holding that sort of Damocles over the heads of the prisoners. He is responsible in that regard. Did he really expect Richard to do it? I mean, it's only about a month or so after the fall of the city that they're actually executed. Did he expect it to be so quick? Did he think he could pad it out for longer? Maybe he did. Did he really think that Richard was going to do it? Maybe at the back of his mind, but maybe he thought he would have more time.
And which is another reason which we should consider for Richard doing it. Part of Richard's motivation as a commander may have been to show to Saladin that he was not someone to be toyed with.
That's another sense we get from some of the sources, is this idea that Richard was almost making a statement to Saladin saying, you're not going to trifle with me, and this is going to be on my terms.
I think it certainly was making a statement, and it was an important one, because we know that Richard rapidly tries to negotiate with Saladin. He for this whole entire campaign, it's something which his enemies use against him later when he's a prisoner in France and Germany, or in Germany, thank God he never gets to become a prisoner in France, is that he's accused of trying to negotiate and not fight this war. And he clearly would like to win as much as possible without risking too many lives. Richard, although being very, very courageous and risking his own life, was always very conscious and very careful with his soldiers' lives. And the fact that he wants to be able to negotiate means that he has to be taken serious as a negotiator. And he has to call Saladin's, bluff in a way. He says, you're trying to, he has to make the point, if we're going to negotiate honestly with one another, I have to be able to trust your word as much as you trust mine, and vice versa.
And the problem is that neither side at this point, well, at all really, actually trusts each other is the problem.
No.
Saladin doesn't trust them, and Richard doesn't trust Saladin to keep his word.
Well, why should he? Because the first time he negotiates something with Saladin, Saladin's the one who doesn't keep his word.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and that whole process of the diplomatic exchange between Richard and Saladin is really a fascinating aspect of the Third Crusade. It's what makes it even more fascinating for me is the fact that it's against this backdrop of holy war. So,
yep.
Yeah, interesting stuff. So before we kind of close on the Siege of Acre today, does anybody have any final comments?
I think we've set the groundwork very well for looking at the next pieces, which are both warfare and diplomacy.
Absolutely, yeah. Next time we will jump into the Battle of Arsuf. So, well, this has been a really interesting podcast. I just want to say thanks to everybody who has helped with it today. Scott, thanks for co-hosting with me.
Certainly. Always glad to.
Great. And Dr. Schrader, always a pleasure to have you. Thanks so much for your commentary.
Thank you.
And Dr. Schrader, did you want to mention any of your current projects that you're
I can't
involved with?
resist. You know, I can't resist if you give me the invitation. I am working on a biographical novel of Bailey and Evelyn. The first 2 volumes have already been released. The second volume covers right through Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem, and the third volume that I'm working on now will cover the Third Crusade. But I strongly recommend everybody read the first 2 volumes first.
Great.
I'm about halfway through the second volume now, Dr. Schrader.
And I hope you're enjoying it.
I'm enjoying it very much.
Great.
Great. And also, Dr. Schrader, your blog, which is Defending Crusader Kingdoms, what's the exact address again?
It's defendingcrusaderkingdoms.blogspot.com.
Yeah, that's great stuff too. Dr. Donnachie, I really want to thank you for being here as well. It's a real pleasure to have your expertise.
Not a problem. Thank you for having me.
Now I know you're not as much of a blogger as Dr. Schrader, but is there anything in particular interesting that you're working on right now, or that in your research?
That very much the same as last time, I'm afraid. The baronage of the Kingdom of Jerusalem after Hattin and the Third Crusade, and the military recovery of the kingdom in the early 12th century. How does it recover from Hattin and the Third Crusade? Still working on that, I'm afraid.
That's great. Yeah, we don't have to hit you with that every single time. It's kind of a lot of the people we have on here are doing some blog or something every week, and so it's kind of a
Yep, no, it's me. It's week after week basically. So I just keep plodding along.
But we want you to tell us when they're available because we're all very interested in them.
All right.
Yes,
well,
definitely.
As soon as I know, I will let you all know.
Thank you.
Yeah, that will be great. And I know we talked about this last time, but that topic, I just find that so fascinating. I would love to do some podcast discussions of that too. So, well, again, thanks to everybody, and thanks to everybody for listening today. This is Real Crusades History. We do release a new podcast on the history of the Crusades every 1st and 15th of the month. And we also do regular weekly videos on YouTube about the history of the Crusades. You can find us at realcrusadeshistory.com. And also on YouTube, our username is Real Crusade History, actually. And we're also on Facebook. Yeah, thanks again, and we'll see everybody next time. Real Crusades History is the best source on the web for the history of the Crusades. Please subscribe to this channel and click on the links to our Facebook and Twitter pages to like and follow us there. If you would like to support our work, click on the donate link in the About box of this video to make a PayPal donation, or go to realcrusadeshistory.com and click on Donate.